Divine blue light, sudden, ungraspable nomadics for John Coltrane. Not as phantom blinding, but the soils of Mount Meru, as quantum, as perpetual, as interdimensional kindling, its hemispheres colliding, as bricolage, as osmosis, as sonic notation, alive as sonic cometary phantoms, understood unto themselves as stratospheric particulates, not merely as tense foundational structures, as a pronoun to be levied as simple sonic ramification. You understood this to be in the infinity of your heart, to be microscopic musical grammar, not unlike phosphates, as a syntax of symmetry resounding as an obverse mirroring of chords, analogous to 16th notes, rising and scattering of their own accord, much like the residue from diamonds that bake, not simply shrill supplication as noise, but as spectral realms of themselves, being sonic blinding bodies that rise and loop and gather themselves on the other side of themselves, not as artifact or translated merger, but as explorational summons, so that the sonic never wizens by pursuing entangled osmosis as complex utopian turquoise. And it was on this plane that you and Dolphy squared private comment into thrilling electrical prophecy that both forged and scrambled light, so that amperage split apart and scattered across soil as interregnum, being blizzards of grammar, not merely emitted from bodies, but sound as hail from unknown wizardry that sired sonic thoughts and streams. Understanding such flow as transmuted acre, can such emit itself from sounding boards of dust, never attempting to lean on criminal piety, all the while ignited by sonic invisibility, as subdivided notation, as darkened gradient, as chain reaction. Coltrane, this evokes its merit as spontaneous rotation, and from your collective eye, the spontaneous emission of notes that you once assembled, the once concurred Delilah, its fragile figurines ignited as curious poles on Saturn, being ionized notation spun from Rashid Ali, beckoning motifs from light, from minuses of hail, that emit from themselves anecdotal grammar. I'm thinking of your sound alive as chronic pre-character, as limitless pre-clusters and fragments, as sonic and parallel to themselves, functioning domain as rhythm, being astral space sired as simultaneous visions of itself. I think of the songbook that was Disney, its apparitional proportion via chronic disappearance that reappears and spins in its own subversion of itself, not merely terrestrial subset of itself, of its anguish and its motives aligned to rhetoric that blindsided and lifts as former body by vibration, other than the anguished motives that attempt to leap from protracted sterility. Train, not merely the vibrational suffix of a monk. Your field of darting measures, your approaches to harmony remain creatively self-suspended. This remains your sudden nebulous aquamarine, your inspirational aquamarine, parallel and brazen with your own self-abandonment as auto-insurrection, self-fueled by higher rendering as darkened guidance with your old intestinal ferment as silence. This being the range that advances itself to yourself, So sonic mesmerization by line, by concrete measure to itself, will always migrate, will ferociously outstrip the singular line. That ignited wholes broken into fragments, not parallel of themselves, but as simultaneous summons of themselves, magnetized, self-guided by bricolage, by grammars that incite arousal. Not garrison according to linear ambush, but ferment as grace. The ferment that embrangles grace with all its improbable complexity. This linkage as concussive charisma, as shadowy spirals, as exploded suns, create densities of themselves, being spirals whirling as interstellar omniscience, being sonic burst, being scribbled calibrations naturally understood as sonic conduction. Train explored the sonic combustion of mirrors, their pillaged after account, the wilderness of grace that found in themselves, not as iconographic shedding or a form of bewildered dust masquerading as cornucopia by fraction that ignites its own darkening, that heightens and inscribes its own maiming. With Elvin, you formed a glare that shielded your soul from great resting, as you rose from invisible tombs formed from strange asteroidal formations. Perhaps, when speaking to Dolphy and Elvin, you convened as a tribe of cellular gods, by eluding all cellular approach, and became vacant. Mesmerized by this vacancy, the pharaoh rose and energized its own option, sans tactical mist and precognitive carbon. Perhaps I can feel your shapes as murals of glass burning, forming of themselves via opposing agendas with sound reflected from invisible yields from the body. Knowing that free access thrives between stars, your energy continues to bloom throughout invisible notation, the latter alive as ungraspable sonics, not unlike the music of herons. Thus, I understand your exploded constellations, their breached tendencies, that breached vestiges, as a neutron array, as that principle minuses Romaine mesmerizing twilight, so that principle minuses remain broached, not as simple dialectical osmosis, but as peculiar free exchange with essence. Beyond the throes of pulse manipulation, always leaping tendency is non-limit. Never a brokered treatise, or a hail that limits itself through envy, but molecules that subsist and dazzle as embittered wonderment, as cratered testaments and inscriptions. This being the realm by which suns emerge and spin, as Ernst Mach put it, this being the manner by which gestures move suns, this being the manner by which hands elongate and spill around corners. This being power as it increases substance on a cognizant plane, is a kind of theoretical groping, yielding candela by emptiness, alive as pointless microhectares, and being analogous to heat sands, a high trail of deserts, akin to toneless micro-calling, not unlike an owl addressing its sound to unsustainable rubies. Alive as quantum treatment to its fever, to its realm of microbial substates. Thus, I hear the mesmerizing waltz of the Shim Shim Shari and the hypnotic parallels of itself as cartographical formation being subconsistent with its own field of broken micro-boundaries, being witness to its own unsettling. In your mind, John, being simultaneous and unsettling, never is linked to mystical, typical personal secrecy, never is linked to mystical, typical personal secrecy, your post-body osmotically grappling with a chronic phantom wall, not vertical retreat into supreme cosmic expanse. As if your phantom dioxide could be called silver, as it blends with expanded heliopause. What power evinces the limitless, the arcane appellation of itself, thus ceasing at growth or dictated boundaries, issuing from your field as a series of infinities that sonically ascend through themselves, not unlike ascending the sheer, sharp wall of Mount Meru, giving a blinding lecture to itself, mesmerically set afloat within the wisdom of its own entanglement, being wrought as quantum lettering that flourishes by bizarre dictation, by highest disregard for personal fragmentation. Thus the impersonal ignites as divine blue light, as bizarre philosophical gesture, analogous on earth to unclaimed trenches, where perhaps imaginary owlfish invade their own borders, suddenly disappearing into transmuted lightning. John, these are realms where the mind fails to match itself as it magically intertwines with its own generating harvest, always alive as phantom, as prophecy, as if a voice had pillaged a transparent kiosk and divided its own cast of molecules, quintessential, never chronically harried, or questioning its own canonical fluidity. Train, it was your grammar that climbed, and now registers as a sonic echo far beyond gregarious misnomer, not as day's mercurial haunting, or as play, or as sound that roams as superstitious poltergeist, being as anthem of itself, as profound philosophical altering of itself. As if legions were controlled amidst their own self-dissemination, being spontaneous paradigm that guides itself throughout galaxy after galaxy, not simply as electromagnetic conundrum, but as confoundment, as philosophical weltering of itself. The profundity of paradigm, your increased nature via ascent, always guiding itself via phosphenes as symbols of sonic rhetoric, of inscrutable sonics. And these symbols hover and increase their own electricity as curious electrical charisma, as Gnostic tutoring of themselves, listening to vapor, electrically extending itself, not as quotidian measurement, but as sands that extend and measure themselves. Never confined to the testament that is reason, but as curious solar element, not as barren niche or relativistic compound, but as the highest drama that specifies complexity.